So much, John, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Emily, John Kiram for helping to coordinate this event, Emily from the New Press. Raja, it's really great to be able to see your face and to talk to you today.
It's an honor.
I feel very lucky to be talking to you today too, because I've known Raja for almost 20 years, and your work, Raja, has really profoundly enriched my understanding of Israel-Palestine, but also more broadly what it means to write and to reflect on political conflict and on the inner experience of that conflict. Raja Shehadeh is just a very special writer, and I've been rereading you lately, and I've been struck by two things. And the first is just the range of subjects that you explore, not just the brutalities of occupation, but the politics of the law, the way that the landscape has been disfigured by settlements and by war, and not least of family life, especially the relationship of parents and children, fathers and sons, and the complexities and problems of your own society as well. The second thing that's really struck me is just the plain spoken, quiet, and unflinchingly honest sensibility that shapes your writing, just the absolute sincerity of it, even down to these disarming notes of humility and humorous self-deprecation, which I think are particularly present in this new work, Going Home. Now, you've had a career as a human rights lawyer, as an activist, and briefly, and not so happily, I think, as a kind of political advisor at the time of the Madrid conference. And we'll probably touch upon some of these experiences in our conversation, but it seems to me that the core of your identity is your writing, this original synthesis of memoir and political reflection. So I thought we'd start by talking about how you became a writer.
I've always wanted to write, and ever since I was very young, I used to scribble things and wrote a short novel when I was very young. And when the occupation began, it was a very confusing time. I was 16 years old, and I started keeping a diary. And the diary was my way of trying to understand what is happening and what's happening to me and around me and so on. And I kept this tradition of writing a journal every day. And it has helped me a lot in my writing throughout. But I've always tried to investigate issues in my writing, personal issues, and then later on, issues dealing with the occupation and with the law and with the landscape and so on. And so it has been a continuous struggle to understand, and I found writing a good way of understanding.
I was revisiting your earlier memoir, your 2000, I think it was 2002, Strangers in the House, about growing up in occupied Palestine. And there's an anecdote in that book where you describe a conversation that you had with the great Palestinian painter, Kamal Bulata. I guess you'd shown him some of your early work. I think it was fictional work, in fact, inspired by Joyce. And he said, I think you should write about objective reality, not subjective reality, or something to that effect.
Yeah. He had this advice, but I was very interested in the subjective reality and was struggling to bring it out in the course of my writing. And it continued. That piece of work that I showed him in 1979 actually was a work that I had started when I was in university, and I continued working on it, and eventually it became The Strangers in the House.
I see. And you did find a way to, in a sense, fuse the subjective and the objective, to write about your inner reality against the backdrop of this, this major event that had taken place in 1967 and that would define the lives of all Palestinians in the occupied territories. But I'm curious. You started to write, and eventually you get around to writing The Third Way in the early 1980s. I'm curious why you decided to write in English rather than Arabic. It's an interesting choice. What was the reason that you decided to do that?
It really wasn't a choice. I started writing English from early on, and I didn't think of writing in Arabic because for me, Arabic was very complicated. You couldn't write as you speak. You had to be very careful about not making mistakes in Arabic. And when I started doing my journal, I typed it, and I could type English but not Arabic, and my handwriting was terrible. And so it's good that I typed it, because otherwise I would never have been able to understand, read what I wrote. So it came naturally, and it's not something that I've ever revisited. It's not an issue that I've ever thought about, why write in English and whether to write in English and so on. It's just been the case ever since I started writing.
Now,
I mean, I write in Arabic for my law practice, but not, but never literary things in Arabic.
Now, Going Home is a walk through Ramallah on the 50th anniversary of the occupation. And when we start the book, you're shaving, you're looking at your face in the mirror, kind of taking stock of things and of your life, which sets the tone of the book. I thought you might want to read a bit from the book.
Yes, I can do that. I will read from the first chapter. It must already be 8, I think, as I listen to the national anthem blasting out of St. George's School near my house in Ramallah. I'm standing at the bathroom sink, maneuvering the shaving blade around the deep folds in my face that have formed over the last few years. Next, I comb the remaining strands of hair, still black, left on my balding head with my old brush. My once abundant hair seems to have made its way south to my nose. There, bursting from my nostrils, I can see plenty that need clipping. How furious my father used to be when I borrowed his scissors to cut my newly emerging mustache and failed to put them back where he could find them. How could I have known then that he needed them for this older man's purpose? As I bring the scissors up to my nose, I examine the brown liver spots on my hands and notice that there are more of them on my temples. I wonder how long they've been there. Next, I study the worryingly persistent red sun patch on my hand. Had I been closer to my father as he was getting on in years, I could have learned about these changes that our bodies go through as they age and been better prepared for what was to come. After finishing my grooming, I look in the mirror again. It's all there in front of me. The bags under my eyes, the furrowed forehead, the corners of my mouth that used to be mobile but have now descended into a permanently sad expression. Disappointment is written all over my face, expressing the real experiences and pains I have struggled through. I no longer have that silly smirk, that effacing, distant, and unreal expression I wore most of the time. The face I see before me has been broken down and reassembled. It's the confirmation of my holding fast, of not escaping or avoiding, of being baptized by fire. It expresses what I have felt and tells all without hiding anything. But things are better this way. I try to convince myself that I'm as old as my face, which is not at all how I feel. Mine is already the face of an older man, somber and serious, with thin lips and wrinkles that bring my expression so much closer to that of my father. My ears, which were always large, seem to have increased in size. My black eyes with long eyelashes are no longer radiant. It used to be that my whole face, whole being spoke through my sparkling eyes. Now the look is inward. I have aged with the years, and with the occupation. Today, 5 June 2017 marks its 50th anniversary. With every year, I come to resemble my father more and more. I first became aware of our striking likeness a few years back during a particularly tense time. I remember entering the barber shop where I have had my hair cut since I was 5 and where my father had also been a customer. Looking in the mirror as I entered, I was struck by what I saw. Mine was the face of an anxious man holding himself together, wearing a fur caracol hat, the same hat my father used to wear, and a thick Harris tweed jacket with wide shoulder pads to add bulk. Yet inside this heavy garment, I was small. And of course, I thought of my father. When he was getting on, he would have a similar look, holding himself awkwardly, thinking of himself as a younger man and straining to achieve the look, but with the tension showing regardless. These days, thoughts of my father are with me more often. For a long time, as I was growing up, he was like a mystery that I wanted to explore. The ailments of his aging body and his mood swings were never discussed, perhaps because he was too proud or too anxious about growing old. So I did not know how he dealt with them. His sacrosanct law office was another mystery. I always held my breath when I visited. His politics, his relationship with my mother, his death, all remain unresolved in my mind. But perhaps most mysterious of all was his life in Jaffa, which I wanted to emulate but couldn't, much as I tried when I lived in Beirut and London. Jaffa, the metropolis, remains the place of my imaginings, where he lived his fantasy life by the sea, in a prosperous and vibrant city. It will always have that special resonance for me, but it's here, in Ramallah, where I find my parents, myself, and my life scattered around in the various houses in which I've lived and written my books. Every morning when I look in the mirror, a serious face stares back. I try to remember that the face I've imprinted on my mind is not the face others see. I know I have another side to me, but who else would know it from looking at me? Where and when did these markers of age appear? How much manipulation and control do we have over how we look? Does our face always betray us? Is the relaxed face of a child the time of our life when we seem to live most in the present, the real face, the real mirror of who we are? Perhaps there is little I can do to conceal anything. They say we get the face we deserve. But is that really true? It strikes me now that each memoir I've written is but another interpretation of my life. So maybe the way my face has matured is just another sort of memoir, one that's imprinted and that I'm not in control of. Maybe this one is the most honest.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Um, I remember first reading it and being just instantly hooked by that opener, and just the very nimble and very touching way that you interweave uh, the the themes of this book in that opening passage of aging and mortality, the memory of the Nakba, dispossession, the feelings of defeat, and your fraught but obviously very intense relationship with your parents, but of course especially your father. But what I want to talk to you about first, before we get to that, is the way that you write about the body here. There's a point later in the book where you say that the smirk that you had on your face, say you call it a triumphant look, has dissipated and been replaced by a forlorn countenance. And throughout the book, there's this attention to the body, or what you call my body in time, and what it reveals of you. And I'm wondering, has it been you have a flair for writing about this physical vulnerability, physical and emotional vulnerability. Has that come naturally to you, or has it been a struggle for you to write so candidly of these feelings of fragility, of precariousness, of aging?
Well, aging has been something that I've been exploring more recently, of course, but I think the body has always been central to my vision of myself and of writing and of and my great ambition was to do the kind of writing that is uh, evocative of sensations and emotions and these to me are very much related to the body.
Um, at the beginning of Going Home, you talk about this recurring dream. You're lost, you're not able to find your home, and you speak of this fear as a strange affliction. Um, so I thought we might talk a bit about the title of your book, Going Home. Your family's original home was in Jaffa, not in Ramallah, and you grew up with these stories about Jaffa as the bride of the sea. Your family, of course, was dispossessed in 1948. So, what does going home actually mean? What is home? Is it Ramallah? Is it Jaffa? Is it Scotland, where I know you spend some time each year? What is this? What do you mean by this title, Raja?
Well, I was thinking of going home in terms of going through the town, which is the arena where all my struggles have happened, and visiting all the old houses where I lived in order to get over and deal with the issues that I have had, whether emotional or political or legal, and be able to come to be at peace with myself in order to arrive at the house. And that was the point of going home. I was going into my 50 years of struggles and difficulties and problems and so on, and trying to understand them in order to come to terms with things in order to be able to be at peace with myself and to arrive home.
So this process of going home is as much a kind of region of the mind as a physical place.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you dedicate the book to Ingmar Bergman, and you cite Wild Strawberries as a particular influence. Had you seen the film just before writing the book?
I saw the film in 1975 and I was so fascinated. I bought the film script. And ever since, it's been one of my favorite films that I keep seeing over and over. And I think that in a way, it was an inspiration because in Wild Strawberries, the old professor who's retired and who's going to Lund to get an honorary degree starts with the film starts with him trying to write his memoirs of his life and struggles, and then he goes to with his daughter-in-law down to where he is going to receive the honorary degree. And on the way, he stops to see his mother, who's 96, who's a very difficult woman. And we can see some of the things that he has problems with related to his mother and the way she is an unemotional woman. And then he also stops by this old house where when he was young, he had this appointment with his girlfriend being kissed by his brother. And that was a big blow to him at that time. And it obviously affected him throughout his life. And so this way of going from place to place and we get to understand this man through his travels through these places, uh, I thought was a very good way of doing it. And in a way, I was doing the same thing with my going home.
And in the process, we also encounter much of the human comedy of Ramallah. We actually meet a lot of Ramallah characters in this book. I would say that this is more densely populated with Ramallah life than perhaps any of your other books in some ways. I mean, I'm thinking of Shopkeepers and that mysterious man named Abu Maurice, who may or may not be German. We don't really know where he's from.
I wanted to show a picture of Ramallah, which, as it was and as it has become, and the changes that happened over the years to that small city. And it is full of strange people, eccentric people, weird people, people of various origins. And I tried to evoke and tell the story of as many of these people as possible. And in order to paint a picture of that place.
I mean, you mentioned to me that a book that had a very strong influence on you when you were young was Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But to me, this in a sense, this is your Dubliners. This is very much a portrait of a city and of its characters. You know, someone else you cite in Going Home is James Baldwin, you know, Baldwin used to speak of this, what he called this burden of representation that fell and still falls on the shoulders of Black writers in America, who are almost summoned to represent the Black experience as if there could be one such experience, and as if one writer could capture it. I've always been impressed by the fact that you don't speak on behalf of other Palestinians. You write from a Palestinian perspective, but not from the Palestinian perspective. So I'm wondering, do you ever feel such a burden of representation? Do you feel as though when you write, you're writing for yourself, or do you feel that in some sense you're obligated to represent a larger collectivity?
No, I never feel I want to represent a larger category. I write for myself and purely for myself and explore issues that are of interest to me. Although when I was at Al-Haq and working on human rights and so on, I felt the need to explore things that have to do with the occupation, but that was a different kind of writing. That was human rights and law and so on, but not literary writing. In my literary writing, I have always written about myself and for myself, originally, initially for myself and then for the public. But I have not felt that I had to, that burden of representation has not worried me actually at all.
You know, you say at one point in Going Home that you know, writers depend on solitude, and solitude, at least when you were starting out as a young man, was deemed disrespectful, weird, or ill-mannered. So, I mean, it seems to me that on some level, the kind of writing that you were embarking on was also an act of individual rebellion. I mean, not just against the larger structures of domination, you know, the occupation, etc., but also against your own society and its expectations of you, or you know, or your parents' expectations of you.
Yeah. In a way, memoir is not something that was very common when I was growing up. And the kind of memoir that I've been writing was not at all common when I was growing up. So in a way, by choosing this genre and pursuing it in the way that I do, it is an act of rebellion. But now, of course, things have changed and there are many more memoirs being written. But at the time when I started, it wasn't at all. And I think that the vulnerability that I show through my writing and the criticism of the society that I show also was not something that was very common. I at the same time, I didn't worry about it. I thought I will write honestly and come what may.
Right, because I mean, you set a very different tone. I mean, you grew up in part in the you know, the kind of the heroic age of the Fedayeen and the national liberation fighter, and the tone that you strike in your writings is very different. And there's also nothing official about it. It's free of it's obviously you're making arguments, but it's free of the kind of, you know, wooden language or polemic that one might find otherwise.
I think the worst thing for a writer is to try and do representation and to try to follow the creed and the political line and propagate something. So I've tried not to do that at all. But at the same time, I have been fascinated by the changes in the land around me, in how the law was used by the occupation. And I've written on these subjects also from a point of, because I was fascinated by them. I tried to explore them and understand them and explain them to others through my writing, but not in a didactic way or in a manner that was propagandist.
And you started doing that very early on in your work, your early '80s work, The Third Way, and it seems to me that in your attention to the way the law was being used and to the settlement project, the transformation of the land, the fact that the Israelis clearly intended this to be a permanent project. This was not a short-term occupation. You, in some ways, resembled your father. I mean, your father was a very distinguished figure, and also very much his own man, an iconoclast, who was quite politically involved too, particularly in the first couple of years after the occupation began. I'm wondering, can you tell us a bit about Aziz Shahadeh?
Well, he was a great influence on me, and he was a man of his own mind, and he was very brave and bold and decided that the solution in '67 was to self-determination for the Palestinians, and he immediately called for it and said that a Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state would be the solution. And he worked very hard for it. But before that, all along, after '48 and before '48, he was a very strong activist for rights and for Palestinian rights and through the law. So he has influenced me tremendously.
He was murdered in 1985 in a crime that was never resolved. And in your 2002 book, you write that he came under threat from a PLO group that had ties to, I think, Iraq or to Syria, but it later turned out that, in fact, he may have been killed by a collaborator.
Yeah, he was handling a case against a squatter who was squatting on church land in Hebron, in the Hebron area. And he was trying to evict him from the land. And this man, who was a collaborator, wrote to him from prison that if you don't leave this case, I will come out of prison and kill you. And we had that letter and we showed it to the police. And the police failed to investigate this man at all, which indicates he was a collaborator and he was being protected. And at the end, he was killed because he was trafficking in drugs.
There's a moment in this book where you write about walking through the streets of Ramallah, imagining that in the eyes of other people in Ramallah you seem mysterious, you're an enigma. But you say that in fact it's your sense now that the people of Ramallah always knew me, perhaps better than I knew myself. They read me like an open book. What did they see that you didn't all those years?
Well, they know me. There is interference. They know me because of my family and they know who I am. There is interference.
There is some sort of sound, isn't there?
Yeah, I've just checked. If everybody could stay muted. I think everybody's muted now, so we should be good now. Sorry about that, folks.
So Ramallah is a small group, and everybody knows everybody else. It's still interference.
Yeah, where's that?
And so,
You're the only two with the mic on now.
It's not on mine. Are we frozen right now?
So,
Should we
every time I speak, there is interference.
I think we have to carry on because I can't.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't seem to figure out where it's coming from.
So, in the case of living in Ramallah, everybody knows everybody else from families and background and so on, and they see me because I've been going through the streets all my life, and they see my exterior, but they don't know anything about my interior. They don't know about my writing, for example. They don't know about my concerns, and so they know me and don't know me.
Raja, when you started to write in the 80s, you became very associated with this concept of sumud that's often translated as steadfastness, which is also a kind of persistence or tenacity. Has your concept of sumud shifted over the years?
I think that sumud has proven to be the most important form of struggle, nonviolent struggle that has meant a lot. And I think that the Israeli occupation has tended in every possible way to force the people out, force the Palestinians out of Palestine. And the sumud meant that we resisted that and stayed put. And that's the biggest obstacle to Israeli winning fully by taking the land without the people. And so I think that sumud has proven to be a very important way of resisting. And I, in a way, haven't changed my mind about that from the beginning till now.
You write about the first Intifada, when you were very involved with Al-Haq and working on various cases to defend the rights of Palestinians. And you say that at that time you felt a closer affinity with the people of my town than I've ever felt before or since. The occupation was an equalizer. It limited everyone's freedom without discrimination and brought us all together as one, rich and poor, men and women. It's a passage that reminds me of a remark by Sartre in his essay on The Republic of Silence, in which he talks about how the French were never as free as they were under German occupation. I sensed in that passage that a part of you is nostalgic for that period because Palestine has become increasingly fragmented and class divided, especially since since Oslo and the creation of the Palestinian Authority. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, many people like me are nostalgic for that time because it was a time of hope, and we had great hopes that things will change and change to the better. And now there is much less hope, of course, of a breakthrough or building a new society that is more equal and that is the kind of ideal society that we had hoped to work on and achieve. So yes, but at the same time, in going home, I tried to get over the nostalgia. And although I wanted to show the evolution of the town and the changes that happened to the town from the first Intifada till after the first Intifada till at the beginning of the takeover by the Palestinian Authority and so on, I didn't want to give in to nostalgia, and I wanted to see things for what they are and to see that the town has had many negative changes that have occurred in it, but at the same time, it's much more vital. It has much more cultural activities. It has young people who have new ways of dealing with the problems and with the world, which we didn't have and which I should be open-minded about. And so I go through the town without this sense of lamenting and nostalgia, and I try to open my mind and see things for what they are.
I mean, I see that mellow, kind of mellowing too in the way that you write about religion, for example. I mean, at one point you're irritated about the noise coming from the mosque. You say it's keeping you from getting to your work, but then later on you say, actually the sound of the mosque is hypnotic and relaxing, and you can understand why religion would be so important to people in a society, you know, where there's such political despair. I think it's one of the few passages I've seen in your writing where you really talk directly about religion, in fact.
Well, I think that religion has taken over from after the demise of nationalism and the despair that has set in. The only resort now is to religion for most people, for many people, and so I was trying to express this for what it is.
And then I mean, there's a point at which you write, what would it be like to have that unquestioning sense of belonging and a strong religious belief? Does that make you feel at all like, and does that intensify your feeling of being an outsider in some ways? I'm curious, because you're not a practicing Christian, and I mean, is
actually no.
Does standing at a remove? It doesn't. Okay.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because in a way, I sometimes, like everybody else, would envy those who have strong faith and who find an ideology or a religion that answers all their questions, and they can feel comforted by it. And I certainly don't have that. But I would not give up my freedom of thought and exploration and intellect for anything.
You write of this Japanese art of fixing broken pottery called kintsugi. It's one of the more arresting metaphors in your book. You write of how in this art, ceramic pieces that have been broken are repaired, and the repaired pieces which reveal the holes where they were broken are actually considered more beautiful than the originals. And you say perhaps that will be the fate of Palestine one day. Well, what do you think that would look like if Palestinians and Israelis managed to discover this Japanese art form and applied it to their broken reality? What do you think that would look like?
Well, our country, geographic Palestine, is a beautiful country, and it's been destroyed by walls and roads and settlements that have been built very quickly and destroyed the landscape. And eventually, what has been destroyed will not be recovered. But at least if we have an appreciation and find a way of living together, then we can have one whole country, a whole of geographic Palestine, that will be enjoyed by everybody living there, and that would be a much more beautiful country for everybody than is the case now. So in a way, that is what I meant.
We have a few questions from the audience, Raja. One question is whether the dogs barking in the background are from Ramallah.
Yeah, it is from Ramallah.
Perhaps that's the interference, who knows. But another question from Leonard Bernardo. What are these new ways, Raja, of young people dealing with life and with political goings on? Like how, I mean, you mentioned that as a kind of source of of hope, that there are these signs of life and cultural activity among Palestinians in Ramallah, which is of course a cultural hub. What are some of the things that you draw hope from?
Well, you know, when I was growing up, Ramallah was a very provincial place and very small, and we had no contact with the world. And when it was a full occupation, we couldn't even get a telephone line, and we couldn't. I remember when we were at Al Haq and trying to make a campaign for family reunification, it was very difficult to send the word out. And we had to smuggle the papers out with people who were leaving through the airport. We couldn't. The post was censored. The mail was censored. The telephone lines were censored. It was very difficult to communicate with the world. Whereas now, with the social media and the possibilities, it's much greater possibilities. And these are being used. And the young people are savvy and they know how to go about telling their story and reaching out to the world and so there is hope in that, I think. At the same time, there is a lot of cultural activities which are of world standard. There are excellent Palestinian films, excellent Palestinian music, drama, dance, all aspects, art, visual art.
Right.
So it's much more hopeful.
We have the inevitable COVID question. There's a passage in your book, Raja, where you write about learning that the Israelis have allowed buses to leave Ramallah through a checkpoint to take worshipers to pray at Al-Aqsa. And your first reaction is one of happiness. And then you realize you've become so used to the closure that you've internalized the new geography that Israel is imposing. And you write how readily we accept the outrageous terms of our confinement. So we have a question from someone in the audience about COVID and about how the COVID-19 crisis is being experienced today in Ramallah.
Well, the Palestinian Authority has done very well with the COVID-19, and we started having infections in Bethlehem from a group of tourists who infected a number of people in Bethlehem. And what the authority did, the Palestinian Authority, is to close Bethlehem and put it under curfew. And so it prevented the spread from Bethlehem. And then they kept control over the whole place in such a way that when cases appeared in one place, they didn't spread to other places. Our problem, though, was with the workers who were working in Israel, who had been infected in Israel and came and infected others here. And so now the workers who are working in Israel, who are coming back for the feast, Muslim feast, the Eid, we are very worried that they might bring back more infections. But the Palestinian Authority is trying to test them before they come in and ensure that they are free of the virus. So it hasn't been too bad, but it's like everywhere else locked down.
Does it? I'm curious whether, though, the experience of this very different kind of confinement, this confinement justified for obviously very, very different reasons, does it at all trigger memories of being under lockdown during the invasion of the Second Intifada, for example?
Well, of course, there was the re-invasion of Ramallah in 2002. When we were kept under curfew for an entire month. And at that time, we didn't have internet or it was very intermittent, the internet. And the electricity was, there was a lot of interruption of the electricity. And so it was, and then of course there was the danger, there was the bombing and so on. So we've had experience with lockdown and we knew, at least I knew how to deal with it in a much better way, and so it hasn't been as hard as it was in 2002 by any means.
Of course. Lindsay Moore would like to know which other Palestinian writers do you read or recommend?
Well, Mahmoud Darwish, of course, is the greatest poet, and Susan Abu Hawa is a great novelist. And I would recommend both of them, one for poetry and one for fiction.
I imagine also Edward Saeed would be a writer.
Well, Edward Saeed, of course, as a cultural figure, and I've been reading Edward Saeed all the time. In fact, this morning I read one of his essays.
Which essay was it?
Sorry?
Which essay was it?
Well, it was about the director of the Battle of Algiers.
An essay on Pontecorvo.
Yeah. And it alerted me to the fact that this man has done another film called Burned, which I haven't seen, which I now want to see.
Queimada with Marlon Brando. Yes, about a slave revolt. Question from Anne-Marie Young. In relation to making the daily life of the occupation speak for itself, I was particularly struck by Raja's description of his friend Maha's experience of trying to get a permit for her son to leave via the airport rather than suffering the humiliation of leaving by the Allenby Bridge. And of course, the humiliation she suffers is acute and all the more devastating because of her expectations and because Raja lets Maha's description speak for itself without further comment.
Yeah, I used, this is a true event, of course, and I used it in order to show that nothing really changed after the Oslo. And it starts with the group to whom she's telling this being surprised that there is still a civil administration. And of course, there is a civil administration, which is Israeli, which is not civil at all, which is military. And she describes this terrible ordeal of going to the administration to get her son's permit to go to the airport. And I describe it exactly as she said it.
We're getting all these recommendations for other Palestinian writers, including your friend Suad Amiri and Ibtizam Azem, the novel, The Book of Disappearance.
I second that, of course. I second both.
Yes, and we talked earlier about minor detail, didn't we?
Minor detail?
Minor detail. It's a forthcoming novel by a very gifted.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Adaniya Shibli.
Exactly. Another writer you didn't mention, I'm curious whether you've read him, is Emil Habibi. Of
course.
Saeed, the ill-fated Palestinian post-optimist. I'm sure you've read that.
It's a classic.
Yes, and I think that Habib, your work is not written in a comic vein, and yet in Going Home and in some of your other work, you have such a feeling for the vein of absurdity that runs through Palestinian life and the absurdity that really defines the whole system of Israel's occupation.
Yes, but he brought it to a very high level and did very well with the post-optimist, which I can't aspire for, at least.
We keep getting all of these other recommendations. Ghada Karmi, Adania Shibli, Ibrahim Nasrallah. I think all evidence that there has been a real, you are part of a real renaissance of Palestinian writing. That's been taking place for the last 2 decades, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in a sense, wouldn't you say that it is in writing, it is in the book, at least in part, that Palestinians have been able to keep alive this sense of country, of identity, of cultural continuity, that, deprived of a country, yet we exist in this space, in this virtual space, as it were.
Yes, I think that's true. It was very important, this writing, and it kept alive a very important identity and explored identity and developed it.
Mm-hmm. That's some of our other questions. Raja, you talk extensively about the disappearance of green space in Ramallah under the occupation. How do you see the link between environmental destruction and imperialism, and how that destruction impacts colonized subjects? This is from Emily Janakiram.
Well, I've written a lot about the destruction of the landscape, and my first attempt at doing that was in Palestinian Walks, where I described walks through 25 years, quarter of a century. And in this case, in Going Home, I described the effect of confining Ramallah to a small space and the effect on people of this. Because rather than have gardens and have green areas, the land has become so expensive that people try to use every bit of it and build high rise and dig down into the ground. And so the destruction to the landscape is tremendous, and the effect on people's lives is also tremendous. And this, of course, is very much related to the imperialism and to the fact that Israel is trying to take every piece of land possible, and whereas the settlements have large areas of land where they can have green areas and proper planning, we are confined to a small space and cannot have green areas and cannot do proper planning.
Raja, at the time of the First Intifada, the Palestinian national movement came to embrace this idea of a state in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Of course, this took the form of the 1988 Algiers Declaration. You were very much a part of these events. Over time, and certainly under Oslo, whose failure you predicted, we've seen that possibility squandered, perhaps irreversibly. And in the meantime, there's been a kind of groundswell of support especially among young Palestinians in the diaspora, but also in occupied Palestine, for a single state, single democratic state in all of the land of Israel-Palestine. And meanwhile, in effect, a single state is in the midst of being forged because of Israel's efforts to annex a good portion of the West Bank. It's in some ways it's a very topsy-turvy situation. You have Gidon Levy, who's a very progressive Israeli columnist for Haaretz, welcoming annexation and saying perhaps this is the best chance for a new opening. And at the same time, you have Daniel Pipes, who's a right-wing Likudnik, saying that annexation threatens, the Jewish state. I'm wondering, what's your sense of things? Do you see possibility and promise in a single state, a single democratic state, or do you think that that how feasible is it? I mean.
Well, the fact is that we are now living under one state. All of geographic Palestine is under Israel as one state. And within this area of which is under the jurisdiction really of Israel, there are two people living unequally with discrimination. And I think the hope is that we will find a way of living together without the discrimination in one unified land, which we are searching for, and we haven't found the way. But now the reality is that we are under Israel, all of us, in various forms and ways. The Palestinians in Israel are citizens, but under discrimination. We in the occupied territories are under Israel, but without the rights. And the settlers are living in the West Bank as Israeli citizens under Israeli law. And so that's reality now.
And you have Palestinians suffering different versions of disenfranchisement. You have Palestinian citizens of Israel who vote but are second-class citizens. You have Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians who hold Jerusalem IDs. So it's this very hierarchical system. Jonathan Kutab writes, Raja, you've always been brutally and painfully honest with yourself and your readers. How do you see the future of Ramallah and of Palestine?
Well, I think that Ramallah has changed beyond repair. I mean, it's never going to go back to what it was before, and we have to accept it for what it is now. And every time I leave Ramallah and come back, I'm shocked at how it looks. But when I'm living here, I look with discrimination. in a discriminatory manner, because if you look at everything and the ugly places, then you can't exist in this place. So you look selectively, and you look at little spots which you like and which you remembered and which are still attractive, and that's how it is. But I think Ramallah has changed irredeemably. I mean, it's not going to go back to the way it was, and in a way, my attempt in this book of going home was to paint a picture of how it was, at least to preserve it in words, because it cannot be preserved any other way.
One last question, Raja, and that pertains to the debate, the discussion of Palestine in the United States. Do you feel that it's become easier or more difficult to talk about Palestine in the States? You visit here with some frequency to give talks. What's your sense of?
Well, I think it's become easier in some ways. I mean, I remember the first time I was able to use Palestine in the title of a book was with Strangers in the House. And when I was told that he's going to use Palestine in the title, I was shocked, and I said, "Are you sure you can get away with it?" And he said, "Yes," and he did. And now Palestine is mentioned all the time. The Nakba is mentioned all the time and has become accepted. And so, yes, it has become easier, but at the same time, it's not affecting the politics. That's the problem. So there's much more knowledge in the United States about Palestine and about the issues, but not it hasn't been translated into the politics.
Yeah, it's one of intellectual advance and political regression. We're going to have to stop here, Raja, but I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time late in Ramallah to talk with me about this extraordinary book. And I hope that everyone who's listening to our conversation, if they don't have a copy, will go out and get one. And I wanted to thank the New Press and McNally Jackson for making this possible.